Intractable situation that Hamas at all costs cannot be part of any solution. Isn't that a mistake?
So yes, I would say, first of all, I do think there's an important difference between the ANC and Hamas.
Is Netanyahu a war criminal? And further, is Israel a state sponsor of terrorism?
So I think Netanyahu should be tried, like any world leader, through that process.
Supporters were acting as watchdogs, and the initial question to anyone who was, in favor of pro-Palestinian was to immediately ask them that question, and that would justify whether they even, were allowed to proceed with the interview.
Some journalists. I mean, there's a range of different journalists.
At the start of the war, we had IDF representatives daily, sometimes multiple times a day, blatantly propagandizing.
The Western media encompasses many, many, many different journalistic institutions.
And welcome to the Muslim Viewpoint, a video podcast powered by the non-profit media platform American Muslim Today. I'm your host, Rifat Malik. Today we are joined by Peter Beinart, the prominent Jewish American liberal columnist, journalist, and political commentator, as well as author, whose latest book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, has just been released. I talked to him earlier this week about his book, The Gaza War, and the implications of Donald Trump's election for the region and more. So welcome to the show, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I want to start by talking about your new book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, which has just been released. Why did you feel the need to write this book? And can you tell us some of the central themes that you're exploring?
Sure. I wrote the book because being Jewish is really at the center of my life, and I'm an observant Jew. It's really a tradition that structures and gives great meaning to me, for which I'm very grateful for. And yet, I've been watching, for many years, but especially since October 7th and the destruction of Gaza, how leaders in my community and even many people that I know and care about managed to somehow block out these images that for me were just so horrifying, confronting, seeing day after day, and find justifications for things that seem to me just on their face so horrifying. And it made me think about the stories that we often tell, or that the leadership of the organized American Jewish community often tells about what it means to be Jewish in relationship to the rest of the world, in ways that I think actually, rather than bringing out our best traditions of justice and empathy, actually kind of have effect of suppressing them and giving us the excuse to essentially justify or not particularly care about things that are happening to Palestinians in Gaza.
And that will be surprising to a lot of people because obviously you expect your faith leaders to focus on humanity and compassion and those kind of issues. Can you give us an idea of the kind of justifications that you found, being disseminated?
Sure. And again, I don't want to, there are obviously exceptions, and those exceptions are very important to me. The people I'm talking about are sometimes not even necessarily always religious leaders, but oftentimes organizational, communal leaders. I think that, so you hear things like, well, the numbers of the people in Gaza are made up, that you can't trust the Hamas health ministry. And I actually go into some detail arguing that probably the numbers are an undercount because there's so many because the numbers are being reported from morgues, but so many people in Gaza can't even make it to a morgue. And they're certainly more credible than Israel's numbers because Israel doesn't have any reporting system for the number of people being killed in Gaza at all. It's not giving the names and the identification numbers. It's just dropping bombs. It really has no way of counting the number of people. So, and also I say, even if the numbers were smaller than they are now, I mean, they would still be horrifying, right? I mean, the number of people, let alone the number of children. So this is just one way, I guess. There are other examples, but a way in which I think a certain form of nationalism or ethno-nationalism has, to some degree, swallowed, I think, certain notions of what it means to be Jewish and how to think and act Jewishly. I don't think this is a uniquely Jewish problem, actually, in today's world. When I look at white evangelical Christians in the age of Trump, one of the things I noticed is that it seems like Christianity's universal message about human dignity is completely lost in this kind of worship of the American state, as if you don't have an American passport, you are worthless. Or sometimes when I look at, Narendra Modi's Hindutva, it also seems like a kind of form of ethno-nationalism, which has kind of swallowed a religious tradition that is much more capacious. And I feel like in this relationship that many in the organized American Jewish community have with Israel, it has that element to it, in which the kind of not just the affiliation with the state, but almost the uncritical worship of the state has essentially overshadowed a religious tradition that has many, many voices and is complicated. I don't want to suggest that Judaism or any other religious tradition only speaks in a voice that prizes human dignity, because religious traditions are vast and multivocal, but there certainly is a very important voice that emphasizes the universal human dignity of all people. And I feel like that gets kind of overwhelmed by this sense of affiliation and to a state that is almost treated as sacrosanct, whereas states are all just human enterprises that need to be looked at critically.
You've spoken about what you've called the latent ideological civil war among American Jews in particular, which was, I think you said, basically reignited or intensified after October the 7th. Can you describe that schism between, I guess, the old guard and the new guard?
Sure. And I should say this doesn't play itself out the same way in Israel. You don't have the same kind of divide inside Israel. But in the United States, because of the particular traditions of American Jews, I think you have a real conflict, which often plays itself out along generational lines. And in some ways, it's the production of an inherent tension that has been there in organized American Jewish life, certainly since 1967, which is when the kind of affiliation with Israel became particularly strong. On the one hand, most American Jews believe in the principle of equality under the law when it comes to the United States. We're a small religious group. We have a history of oppression. It makes sense. And there's a great fear of the idea that America would become a kind of a Christian nation where we wouldn't be treated equally, right? On the other hand, you have this support of Israel as an ethno-nationalist project that does very clearly under law privilege one ethno-religious group, Jews, over Palestinians, right? And I think there's a real fundamental tension in what Jews want in America and then what they want in Israel and Palestine. And I think that younger American Jews, I think, have become more sensitive to that, partly because of their fear of ethno-nationalism in the United States, partly because younger American Jews are more likely to have to listen to Palestinians and to engage with Palestinians and maybe have more capacity to understand their experience, right? And so I think there's also there's a sense among many American younger Jews that being Jewish, that our tradition is a tradition of very open and often fierce debate. And yet on this subject, the community tends to squelch debate, both internally and externally. And so oftentimes you find this real generational divide where younger American Jews have really very fundamental questions they're asking about the behavior and even the nature of this state. And oftentimes their parents or grandparents are frankly kind of appalled to hear these kind of criticisms, because they threaten the core of what these older American Jews believe is necessary for Jewish safety.
Today is, of course, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But while many accept the horror of the Holocaust, they find it galling that any criticism of Israel or Zionism is deemed anti-Semitism, including obviously here in the US. As a liberal Jew who you've said that observes Orthodox Judaism, what role does the concept and practice of Zionism play in your faith and world view? And has that concept or definition evolved over the years?
Sure. I mean, I think that to be fair, I don't think the organized American Jewish leaders tend to say that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but they certainly say that any questioning of the legitimacy of the state or questioning of Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I think that the problem with
Peter,
that.
can I just push back for 1 second? Sorry, I honestly would question that. I think that
Well,
or by and large, if you go by what the media said, what the discussions that we have on the media, the mainstream media, literally any criticism of Israel seems to be interpreted by, the rank and file Jews, whether here or obviously in Israel as well. But there just seems to be a sort of, everyone seems to just be the
Right.
knee-jerk
I think
reaction is to scream anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I do think we disagree on this. You find, for instance, Chuck Schumer gave a speech on the floor of the Congress where he was very critical. He said Benjamin Netanyahu should not be prime minister. It's
He
quite
did.
common in American Jewish spaces to hear critics to say, "Oh, we think Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich, these far right, they're bad," or people might even say, "I don't agree with the settlement process." I do hear those criticisms a fair amount. But what I do think is when people hear criticisms that they claim are delegitimizing the state, saying that there's something fundamentally morally wrong with it, like calling it an apartheid state or settler colonial or committing genocide, or saying that Zionism is racism, then I think absolutely people accuse that as say it's anti-Semitism, and I think that's a big problem because all Palestinians are going to be anti-Zionists, right? I mean, even if you believe that Zionism was something that was good for the Jewish people, let's say you believe that after the horrors of the Holocaust, Jews needed their own state to be safe, which is what many, many Jews believe. Even if one believed that, one has to acknowledge that Zionism has been terrible for Palestinians, right? I mean, it led to their mass expulsion in 1948. And it's kind of been downhill from there, right? I mean, Palestinians are either refugees or they live under military law or they live under blockade. None of them have equal citizenship. So if you say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you are essentially saying that all Palestinians are bigots, and therefore you should never have to listen to them. And in fact, if they're bigots, you could probably even kind of criminalize their speech, which is what we tend to see often happening. So to me, I think this is fundamentally wrong. It can't be, if you say that if you're against Zionism because you want an Islamic state like Hamas does, that to me is a form of bigotry because it denies equality under the law. But if you say that you oppose Zionism because you believe in human equality and you believe that Jews and Palestinians should be treated equally under the law, how can that be bigotry, right? It's the opposite of bigotry. Bigotry is the denial of human equality. If you support equality under the law between people in a country, you're not a bigot. And so to me, what I find very frustrating and disheartening is when people use these charges of anti-Semitism to kind of shut down debates, which I agree with you, I think does happen a lot. And I think it is, to me, a violation. I think that the reason people don't want to be called anti-Semites is because because anti-Semitism has done great harm throughout human history. And so I appreciate the fact that people take that term seriously, but it should be treated with a certain reverence. And if you treat it with reverence because you realize that the power of this term comes because our ancestors suffered so much, you can't use it casually and promiscuously just to try to win an argument that you don't have a better way of winning. That to me is actually a betrayal of our responsibility to our ancestors who suffered so much under anti-Semitism. And yet I see this all the time.
So what does Zionism mean for you today? What does Zionism mean?
So
Are you a Zionist? Are you a liberal Zionist or are you Zionist? What are you?
No. So it's a slightly complicated question for this reason. Zionism before the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 did not necessarily mean the creation of a Jewish state. There were very prominent Zionist thinkers who opposed the Jewish state. Noam Chomsky, for instance, some of you know, actually was in a Zionist youth group in the 1940s as a young man that was explicitly opposed to the creation of a Jewish state. Martin Buber, one of the most famous cultural Zionists of the 20th century, testified against the creation of a Jewish state. Now, of course, since 1948, Zionism has become kind of synonymous with Jewish statehood. I oppose a Jewish state. I oppose a Jewish state because it violates the principle of equality under the law. I don't believe in Christian, Hindu, Muslim states. I believe in states that treat people equally under the law, irrespective of their race, religion, and sex. So that's why I support an equal binational state, not a Jewish state.
So you accept that Zionism is racism?
Zionism as practiced by the State of Israel today,
yeah.
Yes. But the cultural Zionist tradition is, I think, valuable because it's a way of us recognizing that there were people who were very devoted to a Jewish culture in Israel and Palestine, who believed in the importance of Hebrew as a living language spoken by people in this land, which is sacred to us as it is to other peoples. But they had disassociated that from the idea of legal supremacy. So to me, that's why cultural Zionism is important, because I want to make it clear that when I say I don't support a Jewish state, it's not that I don't support a Jewish culture and a Jewish community in Israel and Palestine. Those are very important to me. I just want them to exist under conditions of legal equality.
Mhm. But I mean, as you said, I think that that culture is being used to promote, Zionism in its, the purest form that we're talking about, which is ideologically problematic. They're
I think
using that culture.
any system of legal supremacy that elevates one group over another because of race, religion, ethnicity is legally it violates my core principles about how I think states should operate.
Mhm. You've defended Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the first and only
Yes.
Palestinian American elected to Congress, particularly, I think, when she
I don't
was
think she's the
vilified.
only first or only. Wasn't Justin Amash? I mean, there've actually been some Republican. I think Justin Amash was half Palestinian, right? The Michigan kind of libertarian. But
Yeah,
anyway, go ahead. That's a
I
little.
stand corrected. Sorry. Was she was the
Yeah.
first female? Was she the first female?
As
She has
far as
some
I know, right?
distinction.
Certainly the most outspoken. Right, right, right.
Absolutely, absolutely. And she was vilified
Absolutely.
for writing. I think she on X she said Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, which obviously
Right,
is a
right.
phrase that is
Yes,
again very problematic for some people. Um,
yes.
you defended her on that occasion. You also on a post wrote that the more horrified you were by October 7th, the
Right.
greater your obligation to support Palestinian resistance to oppression that respects human dignity and international law. So,
Right.
in that, were you excluding Hamas?
Yes, absolutely excluding Hamas, because I think what Hamas did on October 7th, and frankly before October 7th, are clear violations of international law and human dignity in the sense that you can't. It is wrong to purposefully target civilians,
Okay.
and I think that's very important for any liberation movement. But the point
Yeah.
that I make is that people who are oppressed are going to resist their oppression. It's a human response, right? And so, if we want them to resist oppression in a way that respects the infinite sanctity of all human life, Palestinian life and Israeli Jewish life, you have to support efforts at resistance that respect that life. And there have been many Palestinian efforts that do that. The Palestinians have called for boycotts and sanctions and divestment. They've had nonviolent marches, like the Great March of Return. They've appealed to the International Criminal Court and the United Nations. And what America and Israel have done is basically defeat those efforts. They've really clamped down and made sure those efforts were ineffective. So when you do that, you actually make it more likely that people are going to resist in the way that Hamas did on October 7th. You can't,
Yeah.
if you're going to be morally consistent, you can't condemn. If you're going to, I think people should condemn what happened on October 7th, but I also think they need to actively support Palestinian resistance that respects international law and civilian life.
I mean, you mentioned, acts of, resistance, BDS and demonstrations, but obviously every movement needs political leadership. They need to
Yes.
organized, politics or political system. So, they have to have representatives. And you
Yes.
also said, I think at Duke University last January, you said that while you weren't a fan of Hamas, you said that if you want to have a legitimate Palestinian leadership, you need to allow Palestinians to choose their leaders.
Yes.
Well, in 2005, 6, Palestinians did choose their leaders, didn't they?
In 2006.
And you know that as a result of those elections, which all the international observers, including the late Jimmy Carter, attested were free and fair, that
Yes.
election result was not respected by Israel or
Right.
by the US
Right.
or any
Right.
Western country. Do you think that that was a missed opportunity to bring Hamas into the fold, legitimize it in the way that the ANC was able to do in South Africa, the IRA in Ireland, and even if you look at Israel's history, Israel was
Mhm.
founded on terrorism. There was
Mhm.
organized gangs, the Irgun gang. They committed acts of terrorism. One of its leaders, Menachem Begin, went on to become the prime minister of Israel.
Sure.
So
Sure.
wasn't making it an intractable situation that Hamas at all
Mhm.
costs cannot be part of any solution. Isn't that a mistake?
So yes, I would say first of all, I do think there's an important difference between the ANC and Hamas in that the ANC, although it was a violent resistance organization, it was not a nonviolent organization. It worked. It did try to maintain the distinction between military targets and civilian targets, which I think is a very important distinction, which I think unfortunately Hamas has often not respected. That said, just because an organization like Hamas is one that is antithetical to my to my views doesn't mean that it shouldn't have the right to participate politically, right? I mean, Israelis have the right to elect all manner of political parties that I find completely violate my basic view of, my political views, and they can still run in Israeli elections, right? So I think that, yes, Palestinians have the right. It's not surprising that Palestinians have Islamist parties, just like, and they have leftist parties, they have nationalist parties, right? To me, the response to Hamas's victory in the Palestinian parliamentary elections in 2006 should have been to support a national unity government, which is actually what Mahmoud Abbas and most Palestinians wanted, right? Hamas would have representation in the parliament. Abbas actually would have remained president because he had been elected separately, right? And then I think the question is what you would have asked of Hamas. The thing that was demanded of Hamas, which is that they accept the Oslo Agreement, right? And that they would accept Israel's existence as a Jewish state, was not a realistic demand to ask of Hamas at that point, because Hamas's entire argument against Fatah was, you were duped. You got into Oslo, you accepted Israel's right to exist, you renounced violent resistance, and were worse off as a result of that. So they're not going to make those concessions again and get nothing in return. What I think the wiser thing to do would have been to ask Hamas to pledge that if there were an agreement between Israel and Palestinians, that Hamas would respect the will of the Palestinian people as expressed in a referendum. So that even if Hamas never accepted Israel's legitimacy, that Hamas would respect the will of the Palestinian people, right? And I think that would have, and I think then I would have also tried to negotiate a long-term ceasefire, a long-term truce between Hamas and Israel that would have allowed for political negotiations to take place. I think that would have been a much more constructive way of responding, and that would not have led us to this horrible situation. It was horrible even before October 7th, as you know, in which Gaza was under blockade, and in which it was became declared an open-air prison by Human Rights Watch, and in which people in Gaza had no real opportunity to create a decent life.
Mm-hmm. As you know, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has a warrant for his arrest, which was issued by the International Criminal Court last November. In your view, is Netanyahu a war criminal? And further, is Israel a state sponsor of terrorism?
So I think Netanyahu should be tried like any world leader through that process, and then they will decide whether they think he's committed war crimes or not. It seems to me that if they didn't think there was a decent case, they would not have issued a warrant for him, right? And so I believe in the principle of international law, and I don't believe it should only apply to some states rather than other states. So there was clearly a process that went through. In fact, the prosecutor, Karim Khan, was actually the guy. He had been America and Israel's choice for that job, right? They actually thought he would be softer on Israel than his predecessor, right? So he didn't come to this conclusion lightly. And if Israel thinks that Netanyahu is innocent, then they should go to these international courts and present the evidence. And I believe that would be true for an American leader, too. I think it's one of the reasons so many people are cynical about the entire international system, right, is that they notice that it's only the leaders of weak states in Africa or wherever who ever have international law applied to them, right? And I think that's wrong. So the whole term terror, I find, is actually become almost a useless term now in terms of terror, right? Because when people talk about terrorism, it's a term that's almost only applied to non-state actors, right? And usually, very frequently, Muslim actors, right? The question to me is, the better question to me is Israel doing things that are making people terrified? Absolutely. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrifying it is to be a person in Gaza. So yes, this is you are inflicting a terror on people, and no state should do that, right? States should. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of my heroes, said that the only thing that's created in the image of God is the human being, right? And a Jewish tradition says that the human being is of infinite value, because when you take one human life, you also prevent that person from creating more human life, because we have the capacity to create life. So the cost is infinite, because you're not only killing that person, you're destroying the possibility of all the future life, right? So we should think about the children in Gaza and all the people in Gaza in that framework, as if that they have infinite value. And I want a state that exists between the Jordan and the Mediterranean that treats all of its people with that kind of reverence.
Do you accept the? I know there hasn't been a legal determination yet, but certainly, human rights groups, the United Nations have indicated that. I think the ICC as well has indicated that what's happened in Gaza is a genocide, or there is a case to be made for genocide. Do you accept, from what we've seen so far, that there has been a genocide in Gaza, or is
It
it
seems
ongoing
to
one?
me it seems to me that the balance of people. I'm not an international law expert, but it seems to me
I
when
don't
I
think you
look at
necessarily
people
have to be, though, Peter. I don't
well,
think
I
you
think
have
that
to
these
be
are.
to.
I think these are terms that have genocide is a very specific legal definition, right? It has a tremendous amount to do with intent, right? Genocide is really in many ways about is much about is it about is the intent to kill, to destroy a people in whole or in part, right? And destroy doesn't even necessarily need to mean kill, right? Because, for instance, when the U.S. applies the term of genocide to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, right, we're actually not claiming that China is actually killing most of the Uyghurs, right? We're saying it's destroying Uyghur group identity because we're not allowing people to pass on their religion and tradition. So
Mhm.
my understanding is that the preponderance of people who study genocide now increasingly believe that what Israel is doing in Gaza does qualify as a genocide. So there's the Amnesty International report. There are genocide scholars like Raz Segal and Omar Bartov who have come to the conclusion that it does constitute genocide. So yes, it seems to me a very, very plausible argument. And I hope it's ultimately can be adjudicated at the International Court of Justice.
Mhm. Um, you've broadly supported the mass pro-Palestinian student protests, which swept across the US and abroad soon after October the 7th, for exposing what you called university and American governmental complicity in the oppression of Palestinians. You also said you understood why Jewish students felt fearful in that whole situation. Do you
Some Jewish.
accept that? Yeah, yeah. Do you accept that in reality, um, those Jewish students were being called out for supporting what many people would argue is a genocidal regime, not for being Jewish? Many were attending pro Israel counter protests and carrying Israeli flags, yet to reporters, they would present themselves as victims of anti Semitism. So the media ended up demonizing those protesters who were by and large wholly peacefully demonstrating. And so in the end, you got a very skewered view of those demonstrations where there were clear aggressors and clear victims. As a journalism professor, or just as someone who's observed what was happening at the time, did
Yeah.
you sense that as well, that these students were being vilified in that way?
Um, you mean the protesters who were being
The
vilified?
protesters, yeah, the
No,
peaceful
I
protesters.
think the protesters often were being vilified, and yet I think that your depiction strikes me as a little bit overly broad, I think that there's more nuance in what I have seen than I think what you're suggesting. So I think that the protests were overwhelmingly nonviolent. There have been some acts of violence by people associated with Palestinian solidarity circles. At Columbia, some of those actions seem to have done, as far as we know, not by students, but by people who came from outside the university, who were happening on the street outside of Columbia. I do think that the protest movement was expressing a very, very valid outrage at what Israel is doing in Gaza and desire for these universities to not be complicit in that. All of that I agree with. And I think this free speech rights of those students was often have been violated and continue to be violated in very, very deeply problematic ways, given that universities are supposed to nurture free speech. I also do agree that I think oftentimes what the protest movements did was they created a sense of discomfort among among some Jewish students, and universities are not supposed to protect people from discomfort. Actually, discomfort is part of the learning process in university. That
But
said,
I think on that
Brenna, let me
point,
just
though,
finish.
sorry,
I think I
go go
probably
ahead, go ahead.
just I think there have been cases, and I've heard them myself and seen examples, where there has been a conflation of supporting Israel and being Jewish. So, for instance, have heard from students that they walk down the street on a campus wearing a kippah, for instance, and someone yells at them, screw Israel, you're a Zionist, these kind of things. And that, to me, is where things becomes problematic, this conflation of Jews in Israel. I also have heard chants at some of the rallies that, to me, were dehumanizing of Israeli Jews. So, for instance, I was at Columbia for a period of time, and I heard many chants, many of which I thought were totally fine. But one chant, for instance, I heard was, settlers, settlers go home, Palestine is ours alone. Right? That's referring to all Israeli Jews as settlers. That I did find problematic because I don't believe there was an act of mass expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, again in 1967. I don't believe that it's ethical to imagine an act of expulsion of Israeli Jews. So there have been some things in the protest movement that I find problematic, but many other things that I also find inspiring. And that's not surprising. Any movement is going to have a multiplicity of voices. The anti-Vietnam War movement, which was a great movement in American history, also had people chanting things like, Ho Chi Minh is going to win, or slogans that I wouldn't approve. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a long answer, but go ahead.
No. And I accept what you're saying, and you can't police every single chant and
Right.
It's a demonstration.
Right.
It would be impossible to do
Right.
that. But I just, just by and large, I just,
Yeah.
I think so many people saw these students who were inspiring, who were peaceful, who were there. And the other thing I would say is that, while free speech is important, for so many, here, including Jews, and even people like you as well, as you said, there were atrocities going on. There are atrocities going on in Israel.
Yes.
You can expect people to be upset about that, and you can also expect them to be vehemently opposed to people who are supporting a regime that is carrying out those atrocities. I don't think it's like they're not equal, are they? One side is saying, you're killing, children and women and civilians, and the other side is saying we're supporting the government that is doing that. So what I mean to say is that it's not like that both have equally valid points. They don't. One side, to humanitarians and to those who believe in justice, would say that one side was clearly in the wrong.
Right. Yes. And assuming that we're not talking about protesters who are justifying what Hamas did on October 7th, I would agree with you. But I also think that the challenge it seems to universities is that students should be challenged to have to rethink things that they believe, and being made uncomfortable in that process is good. And yet you also have to have a degree of respect for students who have fundamentally opposing views, right? Let's say a student comes to a university campus and they grew up in a family that loves Narendra Modi, right? Mm-hmm. That is also a supremacist ethno-nationalist politics, right? That student should be challenged to rethink those views, right? And yet not intimidated or harassed, right? And still treated with respect. Imagine a student comes and they fervently believe that abortion is murder, right? And they believe they're surrounded by students who are complicit in that. They should have that argument and they should express themselves with passion, right? But there's also needs to be a degree of civility and respect. And I think that can be the challenge, the balance, which sometimes can be challenging.
Sure. Regarding, again, some of these student protesters, I was surprised that, and I don't know if you saw these interviews, that when some of them were interviewed, especially on mainstream networks, they refused to condemn October the 7th. And they didn't refuse to condemn it because they condoned October the 7th. Right. That seemed to be clear. What they said, and this was despite being vilified by the media or even blacklisted, losing their internships and jobs. And the stance that they took was taken by many people who witnessed decades of Israeli oppression of Palestinians. Their view seemed to be that if you isolate that date, you're elevating Jewish suffering and effectively invalidating or marginalizing Palestinian suffering. Do you have any empathy with that point of view?
I think it's wrong. I don't think journalists should ask people to condemn October 7th without discussing the oppression of Palestinians by Israel, right? And but that doesn't mean. But I still think that my view that the people answer are wrong to refuse to condemn October 7th. I think the better answer would be something along the lines of, I do condemn October 7th because I believe in the preciousness of all civilian life. And therefore, I also oppose and am resisting Israel's killing of countless numbers of Palestinians and Israel's denial of Palestinian basic human rights. It seems to me the reporter should ask the question in a way that describes Palestinian and Jewish life as equally important. If the reporter doesn't, oftentimes they don't. But then I think you have the opportunity as the respondent to make that statement yourself. But to me, if you simply say, I'm not going to condemn it, you're leaving the impression that you don't care whether Israeli Jews live or die. And I think that's a mistake.
And we're saying, what reporters did. I mean, reporters were acting as watchdogs. And the initial question to anyone who was, in favor of Palestinians or pro-Palestinian was to immediately ask them that question. And that would justify whether they even, were allowed to proceed with the interview. Do you condemn what happened, on October 7th?
Some journalists. Yeah. I mean, there's a range of different journalists.
I would say, Peter, the overwhelming majority of journalists did exactly that. And they didn't give them an opportunity to clarify or to talk about Israel, the suffering of Palestinians. And I would also say to you, I remember there was one interview in particular, and I think it was on ABC, NBC. There was a young woman, young student, I'm not sure which university. She wasn't Arab, Israeli. I'm pretty sure she was either Hispanic or maybe African American or a combination. And she was repeatedly given the opportunity. She said that the reporter asked her, would you like to condemn? And she said, no, I would like to take this opportunity to talk about the oppression of the Palestinian people, because for decades, nobody has ever centered their voices. So I am going to talk about that now. And she was asked again and again, would you like to go? And she said, no, I am going to. I don't think for one second. Do you know what I'm saying? She was it was a principal position, might not have been wise in terms of, she could have created a negative impression. But I thought there was real courage in saying
I don't think that I think that the centering of the Palestinian experience, given how marginalized Palestinians have been in American public discussion, Edward Said famously said Palestinians lack permission to narrate, and they still do. I think that is very, very important. But I don't think you need to do that. I think you can condemn what the attack on civilians on October 7th and still do that. I don't think it's not just a strategic failure. It seems to me, why is it wrong to oppress Palestinians? It's wrong to oppress Palestinians and take Palestinian life. It's wrong because Palestinians are human beings and therefore have the right to equal dignity to all other human beings, including Israeli Jews, right? And so it seems to me that if one says, I'm not going to condemn this because I only want to talk about this, you leave the impression, actually, that it's only Palestinian life that you care about, whereas I think we should care equally about Palestinian and Israeli Jewish life.
So, Peter, one thing October the 7th did for me as a journalist was it exposed what I saw as the undue influence Israel and its officials have over Western media reporting. For months at the start of the war, we had IDF representatives daily, sometimes multiple times a day, blatantly propagandizing with little or no pushback from reporters. Then there was also the self-censorship after these officials would publicly demand the resignation of the few journalists who tried to hold Israel accountable or its representatives accountable. And this was, I saw this happening to journalists in the US, in Canada, the UK, Australia. As a journalism professor, has the Western media ethically reported on the war in Gaza?
I think that the Western media encompasses many, many, many different journalistic institutions. But I would say, so I don't want to say something so broad as to make a generalization about the entire Western media. But I would say, in general, I think we still have a situation, certainly in U.S. media, which is the one that I'm most focused on, in which the Palestinian experience and Palestinian life is not considered equal to Israeli Jewish life, and so you don't, and that Palestinian voices are still dramatically underrepresented, right? In their ability to speak, even though it was Palestinian journalists who were doing almost all of the actual information gathering and fact gathering in Gaza, because they were really the only ones who would be there, and dying in vast numbers, right? Yeah. Right. So I don't think there's something wrong with putting on spokespeople from the Israeli government if you ask them tough questions, right? I mean, they are part of this story, right? But you need to challenge them and ask them difficult questions, just like if you had a representative of the Russian government on, or if for that matter, if you had the American government on defending American policy. And I think too often there is a kind of deference that exists among U.S. journalists, and I think that it leads to people being able to get away with making talking points and not being challenged on them.
Yeah, deference to Israel in this context. I don't see
yes,
this
deference. Although I think
also
deference to the United States. I mean, I think there's also far too much deference to American governmental policy leaders as well. I mean, I think when you see the way that people interviewed members of the Biden administration, I think they were also far too deferential to them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what it exposed was how synonymous Israel and America was. The fact that we allowed the military personnel from foreign country, Israel is a foreign country, from another government, we gave them that kind of status and that deference. Just it felt like we were at war. It felt like America was at war, and these were our military, representatives who were talking about what was going on. So, I take on board what you're saying. Just a sort of last question. I want to talk about the recent presidential election result and to what extent Gaza played a role in the outcome. If you listen to almost all the post-election analysis in the mainstream media, pundits and politicians all say it was the economy, that was the overriding issue. Well, according to a recent YouGov survey, Democrats lost support in all the 6 swing states, primarily not because of the economy, but because of Gaza. That was listed as the main issue for so many people. But the media has I think the only time the media made a reference to Gaza was in terms of perhaps the Arab stronghold in Michigan. Why has the impact of Gaza been ignored or downgraded when so many times, during the election, during the whole the year or so while the war was at its peak, people, when they were interviewed in the streets were by and large raising the issue of Gaza. And this was African Americans, this was Hispanics, this was young people, old people. I even saw young children, just talking about Gaza. Gaza is the reason why, we're not going to support Biden. Why suddenly after the election has it just been written out of, like there's been a whitewash?
Well, I actually wrote a column in the New York Times after the election suggesting that I think Gaza had hurt Kamala Harris. I think that to be fair, there was a lot of, not this particular poll that you're citing is quite striking. There was other polling during the election which showed that Gaza was quite low down in people's lists of voting concerns. My own view would be that I think inflation was the single biggest issue that hurt and inflation, has been an issue that has been hurting income in administrations all around the world in this post-COVID period when inflation has been very high. But I think in terms of non-voters, people who voted in 2020 but didn't turn out for Democrats in 2024, I do think that Gaza was one of the causes of people not turning out for Kamala Harris. So I think it did hurt Democratic turnout. I agree with that. And I think that there is not a sufficient, I think that people in Democratic politics and in the media sometimes had trouble recognizing or were unwilling to recognize the degree to which ordinary Americans actually were being affected by what they were seeing. Because politicians have a way of kind of essentially treating the Israel-Palestine question as a question that you are very, very ginger in how you talk about, and you don't and this kind of moral outrage that people expressed, ordinary people, is not something you hear politicians express. And so I think there was a kind of a gulf between some of the Democratic politicians who've grown up in a certain political climate and a lot of ordinary progressive people who were just genuinely appalled at what they saw.
Mm-hmm. Absolute final question now on the topic of the election. Of course, Trump has come out and he's taking credit for the current ceasefire, the tentative ceasefire. In your assessment of his policies on Israel and Palestine in his first term, including declaring East Jerusalem as the capital, withholding Palestinian aid, pushing the Abraham Accords to essentially isolate the Palestinians, do you think some people have argued that he provoked Hamas's attack on October the 7th? And how much good or harm do you think he can do in his second term?
Trump provoked it.
Trump, yes, big fun.
I wouldn't use the word provoked. I mean, I think Hamas's again, Hamas has a long history of using violence, including violence against civilians. I do think that the Abraham Accords seems to have made Hamas more frightened that the Palestinian issue was basically being pushed further and further off of center stage, and Palestinians were losing the little leverage that they had. I think that to me, I fear that notwithstanding this ceasefire we have now, which I don't think, unfortunately, is going to last for very long, I fear that Trump's policies will ultimately be even worse than Biden's policies. And I know for a lot of people during the election, they could not imagine anything worse than what Biden had done, given that he had continued to send Israel these weapons and protected it dramatically, even as it was destroying all of Gaza. But one thing that the Biden administration did not do, as far as we know from reporting, is they did not twist the arms of the Egyptians to try to force the Egyptians into opening the border so there could be an act of mass ethnic cleansing. And we now already have Trump saying, as one of his first statements in office, that this is exactly what he wants to do, right? And so this is what frightens me. And this is why I think that although I very much understand why so many people emotionally found it very, very difficult to vote for Kamala Harris. But I did fear at the time and said that Trump would be even worse. And I do fear that this statement that he's made now about opening the border with Egypt may be a sign of him being even worse.
Mm-hmm. Peter Beinart, really want to thank you so much for joining us and talking about your book and your view on some really difficult issues, and also just for all the work that you do on this topic and keeping this issue alive. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me today on Muslim Viewpoint. If you value our public service journalism, please support American Muslim Today, a 501c3 nonprofit, by following us on social media at American Muslim Today, or you can donate at AmericanMuslimToday.com. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Rifat Malik.